42 years have passed since the people of Iran took to the streets and brought about the Islamic Revolution of 1979 under the leadership of Ayatollah Imam Ruhollah al-Khomeini. Today, it is a proven fact that the 1979 Islamic Revolution created great hope among the deprived nations throughout the world. What were the main factors which led to the Islamic Revolution, you may ask? A society torn between tradition and Western modernity, poverty and prosperity, dictatorship, and a yearning for democracy. The reasons are countless, but to answer the question in full, one should not look at the 1970 isolated incident. Rather, it was the culmination of over a century's strive to end the dictatorial powers of monarchs, remove foreign influences from Iranian politics, distribute wealth while ensuring both economic prosperity and allow for central guidance and control, and to create a constitution that was both democratic and would not alienate the traditional and religious portion of the population. The world was surprised and astonished by the Iranian Revolution, which was led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini in exile from Paris. The personality of Iran's Ayatollah Khomeini was a critical element in redefining Iran's role in the region. Imam Khomeini's background, charisma, and thirst for revolting for the people of Iran, the atmosphere leading to the revolution. One can understand Khomeini's personality and beliefs by examining his background. His devotion to Islam, reflected by his simplistic, austere lifestyle focused on spiritual matters, attracted the majority of Iranian society, which was stricken with poverty. Many of these traditional citizens flocked to the modern cities seeking opportunity, only to wind up crowded into slums. Imam Khomeini's life of suffering and final return to Iran replicated a legacy of the oppressed experience. Imam Khomeini unwaveringly opposed monarchy, arguing that only rule by a leading Islamic jurist would ensure that the true Islamic ruling was properly followed. Imam Khomeini's noble artistry was he took the corrupted system that had been ruling the country and replaced it with a political system of service to the people rather than ignoring them. Welcome to the Mideastream. I'm Marwa Osman. The story of the Iranian Revolution is not similar to the story of other revolutions in the 20th century, as the wave of Islamic Revolution swept away the Shah's corrupt regime and brought a new political discourse which cannot be categorized either as a communist or a capitalist, and always will be an Islamic revolution. To discuss this issue with us from Beirut is Mr. Mohammed Abed, political commentator. Thank you for being with us, Mohammed. Now, just how major was the impact of the revolution that saw the ouster of Iran's king of that time, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, and the beginning of the era of Ayatollah Sayyid Ruhollah Khomeini as the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran?
Well, first of all, you have to take a look at the whole region in general, and you will understand all these changes that took place throughout these 40 years. At that time, you had the major conflict, which is still here up till now, which is the Arab-Israeli conflict. The time when Israel was the so-called invincible army, at the time when they used to launch, the Israeli occupation used to launch any aggression whenever they wanted at any Arab country. They reached up till Tunisia and other faraway countries like Sudan. Now we see that Israel, the occupation entity, right now is a besieged entity that is surrounded by rockets and missiles that are really spreading fear among the Zionist settlers. And all this is due to the policy which was adopted by the Islamic Revolution in Iran. I mean, the creation of patience that took the long run into consideration, not rather very easily achieved the victories, but rather ones that took some time in order to be achieved. And I mean, this brought a shift and a major upside down, if you will, change in the strategic equation in the region. You saw the aggressor, now we see the aggressor, which used to take freedom in launching any aggression wherever they wanted, are now besieged even by the Gaza Strip. They cannot even launch an aggression on Gaza without taking thousands into consideration. So this is one of the major shifts that I see deemed that are very important and are the outcome of the Islamic Revolution and the Islamic Republic.
Well, 4 decades later after the revolution, in what aspect is this Islamic Revolution in Iran still mostly visible while the country still suffers from the fiercest economic and political sanctions that has ever hit a sovereign nation?
Well, also to take a logical course in this domain, look, in spite of all these economic sanctions and all this blockade against the Islamic Republic, you see that it is the major strategic power in the region. Whereas other countries, such as Saudi Arabia, such as the United Arab Emirates and others, are not taken into consideration when it comes to the major players in the region and at the international level. You do not see, for instance, the United States minding whatever the Saudis are saying, whereas you see every move and every act taken by the Islamic Republic of Iran is minded and is taken into analysis and so in the whole region. So this is one example. I know because of the shortage of time we cannot discuss this in a very long way, but this example that in spite of all these sanctions, in spite of all that sort of punishment that was being targeted the Islamic Republic due to its political stances and due to its support to the oppressed throughout the region, mainly those related to the Arab-Israeli conflict. You see that Israel you see that the Islamic Republic is being punished for that. But still, one major lesson that can be learned to all the revolutions that are to come throughout history is that the Iranians have been supreme teachers in teaching the world how to turn a challenge into an opportunity. Sanctions in order to develop their industries, to develop ways of
this is what I want to discuss further, because what you said is it falls on the shoulders of merchants, on traders, intellectuals, urban masses who played a grave role in the success of the Islamic Revolution led by Ayatollah Sayyid Ruhollah Khomeini. These categories of citizens have suffered the most under this current wave of sanctions and the sanctions that have been there for the past 40 years, because the West believes that for a regime change to work in Iran, they have to target these specific categories and suffocate them as much as possible. How do you think this plan have worked?
Well, this is not new to the arrogant powers. Whenever they cannot achieve any triumph while dealing with their major opponents, I mean the government of Iran or the leadership in Iran, they turn to the weaker side. They try to target as you said, the merchants, the ordinary people in the street. We have seen this also in Lebanon. Now, when they cannot achieve any victories against the Islamic resistance, they turn to suffocating at the economic level all the Lebanese people in order to turn into a phase when the whole Lebanese people, and hopefully, and I'm sure this inshallah will never happen, that the whole Lebanese people would turn to the accusation to the Islamic resistance that you are the reason why we are falling this. Now, the Iranians, and in a very clever step in this regard, have always focused on insight, on the well-awareness of the whole factors and elements of the conflict. It has become clear that to all the people in Iran and Lebanon, all over the region, that if you give up to the demands of the oppressors, to the arrogant powers, the United States basically, you will have to pay a larger price than the one you are paying when you are steadfast and you are standing up against those challenges. So that's why this question that those merchants, one way or another, know that if the Americans come to control the region, to control Iran, they are going to absorb and use all their resources of the country, and the merchants will, and all the Iranian citizens will be paying the price to that. So the creation of this insight among the people of the Islamic Republic has been also fruitful and has been successful in this regard.
Well, we have less than 2 minutes. I want to ask you about the continued development and actually the impressive industrial progress in Iran, despite the sanctions. But it is conveying a message to the world that Iran will never stop its development and while simultaneously resisting the U.S. vicious plots in the region. But in that regard, a lot has been said about Iran's nuclear program. How do you think Iran will maneuver around this that's supposedly a very large red flag by the West?
Yes, they have been doing this successfully for over 20 years now. They have been dealing with the threats. They have been dealing with any good or signs of rapprochement, if you will, from from the Western world, with similar steps. So there is no fear on this. But once again, I have to repeat this issue of the creation of the human that is willing to stand up against any challenge in order to develop at the nuclear level, at the other levels of industrial, and a few weeks ago, I think a new car was manufactured in Iran, a new model. So you see, the sanctions have not been able to achieve their goal of creating despair in the people of Iran.
Well, we still have to see how this supposed rapprochement, if it will happen, and how it will happen. I want to thank you very much, Mohammed Abed, political commentator, for joining us from Beirut to talk about the effect of the Islamic Revolution inside of Iran. Thank you for being with us. Please stay tuned. We will continue this matter about how the revolution affected the region after the break. The victory of the Islamic Revolution in Iran revived high hopes in the region of West Asia, especially for the Palestinian people and the Lebanese people who suffered from the existence of Israel, specifically that Imam Khomeini's position from Israel was clear from the very beginning. The Islamic Revolution became the main force facing the Zionist project in the region and the main backer of the movements, while helping create a regional power of allied resistance forces. From a revolution to a regional force in this following report. Israel invaded Beirut in 1982 and drove the Palestinian resistance fighters out of Lebanon. There was fear of a coming horror and new alienation. Almost everything would have fallen apart had it not been for a few heroes who kept their fingers on the trigger in the face of what was defined as absolute evil. For so long, the Israeli entity thought that in its war on Lebanon, it would push its last opponents to surrender, which paves the way for scripting a new history for the region. However, its endeavor was faltered by a group of back then with a strength which came solely from faith that was later sponsored by a man who believed that the main confrontation with powers ruining the region could not take place until after the fall of the Shah of Iran, and as he said, happened. The Islamic Republic of Iran translated the words of its leader into actions, sponsoring the first resistance force in Lebanon and later in Palestine with training, weapons, and funding until the victory of Lebanon was achieved and liberation was attained. Lebanon's victory was a good news for all oppressed countries, organizations, and individuals, as it increased steadfastness and determination in the path of what one aspires to in terms of glory and elevation, the realization of independence, the establishment of justice. From Baghdad to Damascus, Beirut, Gaza, and Sana'a, passing through the oppressed nations of Bahrain and Hijaz, this yearn for social justice and liberation and the formation of an allied force of resistance across the region of West Asia would not have been possible without the support of those who believed in standing with the vulnerable in the face of the arrogant. It is what the essence of the revolution of Imam Ruhullah al-Khomeini was all about. The Islamic Revolution of 1979, which brought about the emergence of the Islamic Republic of Iran, became the awakening of the peoples of our region and beyond. The Islamic Republic of Iran's model of confrontation with imperialism has challenged the US and its puppet Israeli region and across the entire world to such a degree that Iran's strategic influence in the form of an allied forces of resistance has become the US and the Zionist regime's biggest concern. To discuss this issue with us from London is Shabir Hassan Ali, political commentator. Thank you for being with us. Shabir, now, since its inception, the Islamic Republic of Iran has challenged the world's corrupt political system and created new political spaces that enabled the oppressed, for example, the oppressed Palestinians to resist the American imperialism and the Zionist occupation. This has been a very long and bumpy ride in the region. How far will this be going? The current wave of regional normalization with the Israeli entity?
I think, first of all, the normalization will not make any difference. The normalization has always really been there. It's not something new. It's now just formalized. The resistance factions on the ground are alien to the occupiers that occupy them. For example, if you look at the countries of so-called UAE or so-called Saudi or so-called Bahrain, these countries are not ruled by their own people. They're ruled by imports, people who have no connection to the actual land and are purely working for the Zionists. The same way that Palestine is occupied by European Zionists, same game. So in reality, the normalization, I don't think will make any real difference. What it will do is it will make things a lot clearer in many ways. And it will hasten the demise of these entities like so-called Saudi Arabia, so-called Bahrain, so-called UAE, and all of these, as well as, of course, the parent of them, which is the Zionist entity occupying Palestine. And I think the important thing that we need to understand is what Iran is doing is not something particularly strange or particularly problematic from a global perspective. It shouldn't be seen in this way, because if you look at all of the global countries, people have alliances. This is from history, from ancient history. People from different countries, they make alliances and they work together to try and better their lot. Now, if the countries that are making alliances are occupied by third parties who have no space there, then at the end of the day, a responsible country like Iran will make an alliance with the actual people on the ground, which is really what the country is. The country is not made up of these one or two families. It's made up of the actual people on the ground.
And this is actually what scares the Western regime, because they extensively condemn the regional coordination that the Islamic Republic of Iran was able to achieve along with the allied forces of the resistance in all of West Asia, to a point that the once surrounded Iran has now the presence of the colonialists, the presence of the occupiers in the region. This led to a maximum campaign, pressure campaign of sanctions for everyone, including the allied forces of the resistance, not only for the Islamic Republic of Iran. How much do you think this will damage the performance of the regional allied forces of the resistance in West Asia?
I think if we look at the policy of sanctions, maximum pressure or otherwise, it's actually more damaging to the party making the sanctions. In the case of Iran and the resistance axis, the sanctions have been more damaging to America and to the West because they have lost a very, very important market for which they can do trade. As for Iran and the resistance, of of course, there is a short-term pain, but ultimately it forces people to be reliant on themselves. And like Imam Khamenei has said, and even Said Hassan had said, we need to start relying on ourselves. We need to stop relying on the outside. And at the end of the day, the allies that the resistance axis has got, such as China, such as Russia, these are the powerhouses of trade in the world. Like China, everything is made in China. You know, from the most amazing things that America claims are its own, nothing is actually made in America. America is useless in terms of manufacture. Everything is made in China, and China is friends with the resistance axis. So even though these sanctions with the extraterritorial components and all of this pressure and all of this, really this is only valid from a PR perspective. In reality, while there is pain for the people on the ground, I'll not say there isn't pain. What it will do is when you push a person hard, ultimately what will happen is that person will say, well, okay, fine, there's no point me trying to negotiate with you because you're just not interested. I will go and make this myself, or I will deal with people who will deal with me.
Well, this is exactly what happened in the region, because we saw the emergence of Hezbollah in Lebanon to face the Israeli aggression. We saw the moral boost that was provided to the popular mobilization units in Iraq by the Islamic Republic, and the regional Cold War against both Saudi Arabia, to be honest with you, and also the Israeli regime. We had flavor to the anti-imperialist sentiment in West Asia as a whole, and even openly challenging Western foreign policy by giving aid to Latin American countries, for example, like Venezuela. How can one explain this smooth flow of inspiration from the Islamic Revolution to cultures that are not even Islamic?
I think what we have to understand about the Islamic Revolution is while it was Islamic, it was actually a global revolution of the oppressed against the oppressor. And Imam Khomeini mentioned this many times in many of his speeches, that anyone who sees themselves oppressed at the hand of the empire, at the hand of the powers of global arrogance or Zionism, they will all come. For example, if you take Venezuela, Venezuela has been hammered really badly. Cuba even has been hammered very badly by America just for wanting to be different, just for daring to be, to follow a different political ideology, and to not allow the infection of American capitalism and its various tentacles, if you like.
Simply for wanting to be sovereign nations.
Exactly, they want their sovereignty. And America doesn't want people to be sovereign. America wants people to be beholden to the empire. And when other countries see someone who is like a standard bearer, a flag bearer for this movement of anti-imperialism, anti-arrogance, they all sort of come together, because good people generally come together in terms of our religious beliefs and all of this, but in terms of the ideology against imperialism and against oppression, everyone is on the same page. And that also lets people discuss later on religious ideas and find commonalities in all of this.
Well, I have less than 2 minutes, but I want to discuss what the Biden administration might bring forward to the table in the region of West Asia, because they are sending sort of vague messages. They want a rapprochement, but at the same time, they are increasing their military maneuvers in both Iraq and Syria. They're even again backing ISIS and Daesh and Al-Qaeda in Syria and in Iraq. They're targeting popular mobilization unit bases as well. It is obvious that also the revolution, Imam Sayyid Ali Khamenei is suspicious of the American intentions. Do you think the region is moving towards negotiations or just a huge explosion?
I don't think there's going to be any negotiations. America has clearly said that they're not willing to reduce any of their sanctions or do anything from their side in order to encourage Iran to, have, as a show of good faith. I think ultimately what they will do is just like what Obama did. They will manufacture and they will feed things like Daesh with a means to try and break the region further and cause more problems. But I think this time, the damage that will be done to the empire will be very serious. And it will end up leaving and taking its lapdogs like the Saudis and the Israelis out of the region. It won't be easy. I think that, as they say, you can see the light at the end of the tunnel.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Shabir Hassan Ali, political commentator, for joining us from London to talk about how the Islamic Revolution led by Imam Ruhollah Khomeini affected the entire world, not only West Asia. Thank you for being with us, and thank you for watching. Please stay tuned next week for more from the Mideastream.